Welcome. In this video, I would like to explain you what utilitarianism is. This is one of the basic approaches in ethical reasoning. It explains how you come to define what is good and what is bad. Let's say you have two choices, A and B. You have to decide which of them is better one. A utilitarianist would choose the alternative which brings benefit, utility, to the largest possible number of people. Let's take the example of income distribution. How would you distribute income if you were a utilitarianist? If you had to choose between distribution A and B, you need first to sum up all the benefits costs, net utilities, gained by each of the person due to the A distribution and compare it with the sum of netto utilities by B distribution. What kind of distribution will be better? To answer these questions, let's consider the following case. Okay, you have an actual distribution. As a rule, it's not an equal distribution, but one in which rich people have much greater share of the income proportionally to their size in the population warrants. You may visualize such a distribution of income by the Lorenz curve, which will be discussed later. You may ask if you could change this distribution. Of course, it depends if the new distribution will cause a gain in benefits or utilities by poor people, and if this gain will compensate the loss of benefits by rich people. If you give the same income to very poor people as to the rich, it's clear that the growth of the utility by them will be greater than if you give it to rich people or people earning. However, imagine if you have to take this income from the rich. Consider the loss of the utility. How are you to imagine this? If you are a millionaire and lose $10, your loss of utility will be very little one. You lose maybe one coffee. On the other hand, the gain of the utility for a very poor person will be enormous. She may well gain some additional days of life. So it seems at first sight that such a change will produce netto utility growth. The gain of the utility will exceed the compensation of the experienced loss. But this is an extreme case. What about the distribution between a person who earns an average wage and the person who earns a bit less? Here we have to consider that in such close cases, the loss has more than the gain of the same amount. In recent decades, there has been some evidence for this utilitarian observation from the behavior of economists. In such a case, redistribution will not lead to a gain in distribution, so neither providing equal distribution nor unequal distribution of income would be a good alternative for utilitarians. However, the correction of the redistribution towards the equality may be a good option. What about the minorities? This is a weak point in utilitarianism. Let's imagine that you have a minority, a vulnerable group of people, maybe older people or those with reduced mobility, who need a lot of money in order to cover their basic needs. Would it be ethical to give them money, or would it be better to give it to the majority to provide for less important needs? You may consider such an example. Think about installing a coffee corner for all the people working on one floor. Or, alternatively, a special installation you would have to build to provide access for one disabled person. Both solutions cost the same, but the first one raises the utility of many people, and the second provides utility for only one of them. But it is a good thing to enjoy a coffee and not give the right of access to the job for one person. For another personal example, I'm a hearing impaired person, and as a student, I couldn't listen to a majority of the lectures in large halls. This could be helped by connecting the microphone to a hearing set. I started to study in 1995, and I can imagine that this technology was probably not affordable then. However, after almost 25 years and many changes at the university, we still don't have this solution. Only in some of the conferences is there the possibility of listening to the lectures with a hearing set, which permits a hearing impaired person to understand. From the utilitarian point of view, such a decision may be justifiable. There are not so many persons with hearing problems, and maybe their needs cost more than a satisfaction of the needs of larger number of other persons. But is it a good decision to ignore the needs of the minority? So you come to another problem of utilitarianism. It is a definition of utility and its operationalization. What is the utility exactly? A benefit? A pleasure? But which one? Does it rank more highly on Maslow's hierarchy? Or does it rank lower? Do you have two great utilities? Is the utility resulting from the satisfaction of basic needs higher than the utility of buying a Ferrari? Is the utility of a cup of hot water of more value than the utility of the access to work? Many economists who reason as utilitarians come to the conclusion of non-comparability. One such example is Pareto. His idea of distribution, which will be discussed later, reflects doubt in the possibility of comparing benefits between people. However, you can ask whether this isn't throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Without doubt, Pareto doesn't see the rationale of the redistribution if the state of anybody will be worse. So even if one person will have all the income and the rest nothing, it won't be permissible to take money from this person and to give it to other people. What's the difference between the action and rule-oriented utilitarianism? You know already that for a utilitarian, a moral action is a good action when the consequences of the action are giving maximum utility to the largest possible number of people. But now you can ask, if you make this action a rule, what are the consequences of this rule? Let's consider a relatively trivial case. Paying for your ticket on the bus. Let's assume that there is not much supervision on the bus. You may consider that it is a better option if you don't pay for a ticket. Society is losing only €1. You are gaining one. The loss for each member of the society will be microscopic and not visible, and maybe you could buy a hamburger which will give you enough to eat for the whole day. However, if you consider that you could do it as a rule and all the other people do so as well, you can imagine that this could cause the collapse of the whole public transport system, as it would lose its entire ticketing income. Viewing the consequences of not paying for the ticket as a single action or as a rule yields completely different result. Viewing it as a rule, your conclusion will be much closer to the deontological solution, even if you think about the consequences. So, in action utilitarianism, you ask about consequences of one action, what happens if I do this? And in rule utilitarianism, about consequences of a rule, what happens if I always use this rule? Summarize. Utilitarianism is one approach to ethics where I'm asking what is good or bad, and I take decisions analyzing the consequences of the action and, most of all, the costs and benefits which are resulting from the action for all involved. You have to choose the option which provides the maximum utility for the largest possible number of people. Secondly, there are two kinds of utilitarianism: the action and rule utilitarianism. In action utilitarianism, you focus on the consequences of one particular action, and in rule utilitarianism, the consequences of the rule. There are some weaknesses of utilitarianism, as discussed in the problem of minorities and the definition and operationalization of utilitarianism. Thank you for your attention.